systems that exist in India and the energy modeling ecosystem in India, and help to provide more policy relevant inputs in these challenging and exciting times for the energy sector. My colleague Srihari Dukkipati will begin with a brief presentation about Rumi lasting about half an hour. This will be followed by a panel discussion on the importance and role of demand-oriented modeling, moderated by my colleague Aditya Sunekar. And we are delighted to have with us an excellent panel for the discussion consisting of Shonali Pachauri, Navroz Dubash, and Thomas Spencer. Before I hand over to Srihari, I'll just mention a few housekeeping rules and announcements for the smooth conduct of the webinar. One, since the Rumi presentation today is going to be quite brief, just about 25 minutes to half an hour, you will understand that we will not be able to provide all the details of the approach, methodology, assumptions, and so on that we have used for the model. So what we will do is we'll share with you a detailed slide deck that provides many more details on these aspects. A link to the slide deck will be shared with you on the chat window during the webinar, and it's also available on our website for you to download and watch at any time of your choosing. The second point is that for the Rumi presentation, please type any questions you may have in the question and answer box, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can through the Q&A box. Please do not hesitate to get in touch with us later too after the webinar if you wish to discuss any point more. And for the panel discussion, again, you're welcome to post some questions to the panel on the topic of today's discussion. Once again, please enter your questions through the Q&A window, but try to keep them as broad in nature as possible so that they're of general interest to a wider audience. We will try to collate as many of these questions as possible and pass them on to the panel for their response. With that, I'll pass it on to you, Srihari. Can you begin the presentation? Over to you.
Thank you, Ashok. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. We are glad to have you here and to explain the Rumi energy systems model that was developed in-house at Prayas. I will be going, as Ashok mentioned, I will be going over the details of Rumi over the next 30 minutes or so, beginning with the approach towards developing this model, the methodology that we have used for developing the modeling framework, and then a particular instance of the modeling framework, which is the Rumi-India model that we've developed, the scenarios that we've defined for that model, some of the results and insights that we are getting from that model, and a comparison with other model results if time permits. Talking about the approach that we've taken, when we looked at the energy systems modeling space in India, the efforts that are underway in India, we saw a couple of gaps that we felt were important to address, and that was one of the reasons why we chose to develop Rumi. One of the gaps is the unavailability of an open source energy modeling platform that is used to sort of inform policy in India. So one of the first goals of developing this model was to develop a transparent open source energy modeling platform. And the second gap that we saw to a lesser extent is a focus on demand among the energy modeling frameworks that are being used in India to inform policy. And so to some extent, bottom-up energy service oriented demand estimation is done by some models. But we wanted a little bit more disaggregation in terms of the spatial, temporal, and consumer type details that could go into the model. By that, I mean, by spatial, we mean like at the state level, at the disaggregation of a state, and within the state also rural and urban geographies. And by temporal, what we mean is lesser than 1 year, an annual granularity. So which I'll come to in the next point as to why we felt that was important. And the third aspect of disaggregation is the consumer type, which is essentially, for example, for households, we thought it would be useful to have disaggregation by quintiles. And similarly, for example, if we were to do industry, then there would be small, medium, and large enterprises, etc. And the next aspect next aspect of the model is to optimize on the supply side. We optimize electricity capacity addition to meet the demand, and as well as fuel demand at an annual level. But electricity is a sector that is disaggregated temporally in terms of providing diurnal and seasonal variations, and hence the electricity demand is also provided at that granularity, and the supply choices are made according to what is optimal to meet demand at that granularity. For of course, all of this is to do policy relevant analysis, and to sort of to be able to ask questions that are relevant for policy making in the current juncture, when there is a huge transition that is underway in the energy sector, both due to moving to cleaner energy sources, as well as increased electrification in the energy sector. And finally, we do not think that Rumi will be a one-stop solution for all modeling needs, obviously. And no modeling framework would probably meet that. But we wanted Rumi to be able it to be easy to sort of integrate Rumi with other models, perhaps those that are looking at various other aspects of the energy sector that are not covered under Rumi, as well as other allied sectors such as land, air, and water. So we wanted it to have an easy, simple interface to be able to integrate with these other models. And going with the sort of open source philosophy, we developed the model from scratch in Python, and a little bit of R programming language as well. As you all know, Python is an sort of an open source computing language, which is available, the tools for which are available for free, and Python itself is developed in an open source manner, and has a dynamic, a vibrant user community as well. Moving on to the the architecture of the Rumi modeling framework. I will talk about some of the specifics of the Rumi-India model that we've developed, but some of these could probably be generalized for future sort of additions that will happen to the modeling framework. Beginning with demand, we currently have five demand sectors that are defined in the framework. These are residential, transport, agriculture, industry, and others. And of course, commercial demand falls in the others category. And apart from residential, all the other sectors are partially top down, in the sense that they are estimated based on demand, GDP projections into the future, and some elasticity based on those GDP projections. And apart from that, we've also made adjustments to incorporate past trends, as well as take into account certain changes that we see happening in the energy sector going forward, and then estimated the demand accordingly. For the residential sector, we have a more detailed sort of specification, beginning with energy service demand across five different residential energy demand categories: lighting, cooling, cooking, refrigeration, and others. The others would include communication, entertainment, heating, service needs, etc. Um, and given these service needs, there are certain technologies that are specified that meet these service needs. So it could be appliances, etc., and efficiencies of those technologies. In addition, we also sort of derive demand, especially cooling demand, based on temperature projections that are monthly temperature projections that are output by climate models, and those are used to determine the cooling service need. And as far as the households are concerned, the households are disaggregated into state, urban, rural, and fractiles. That is true of the base year data as well as the projections that are made for as part of this modeling effort. And in each household, the appliance ownership in each household, in each category of households, is determined based on the monthly per capita expenditure of those households. So all of the households are divided into quintiles as per their monthly per capita expenditure, and then the ownership is determined based on the MPCs for those categories, the average MPCs for those categories. On the supply side, we have the all the fuels that are used for either end use or for electricity production, detailed out in the model. And these some of these fuels can be either domestically produced or imported. And of course, some of the fuels are also used to produce electricity, which is then used to meet the energy demand. We've also modeled storage, particularly specifically battery storage at this point. And we do not model at this point. We do not model the refining process. So we assume that the petroleum products are either imported or produced domestically, but we are not modeling the refinery transformation of the crude oil into petroleum products. And supply technologies are then specified with various capacity addition limits or domestic production limits. Imports are assumed to be available as needed, and for all of these, we provide efficiencies, capacity usage utilization factors, as well as cost trajectories. And all of this comes together by matching supply and demand at various temporal resolutions. For fuels, the temporal resolution used to match the supply and demand is at an annual level. And for electricity, it is done at the level of the time slice, the lowest time slice that is defined in the model. Coming to the specific configuration that we used for the Rumi-India model, the horizon that we've considered for the model runs is 2019-20 to 2030-31. So fiscal year 2031 is the final year of the model, and the geographic disaggregation that we've provided is 25 states, where we have union territories grouped into one state and non-Assam Northeast states grouped into another state. Apart from that, all the other states are modeled separately. And then each state is broken down into rural and urban geographies. With respect to electricity, we have a temporal resolution of 5 seasons, the usual summer, monsoon, autumn, winter, and spring, and then 6 day slices for early morning, midday, then afternoon, evening, and night. So these are the typical days of each season that are modeled. And with respect to generation technologies, we have coal, open cycle gas, close combined cycle gas, nuclear, hydro split into small and large hydro, but and solar, wind, and biomass. Storage is specified as 4-hour and 6-hour batteries. And one thing I forgot to mention when talking about balancing is there is the ability to provide multiple balancing areas. For example, we could do balancing of the electricity demand and supply at the state level or the region level. But for now, we have chosen to have a national balancing area. So there is only one balancing area for electricity. As far as fuel is concerned, um, we have not we the fuel is matched at an annual level, like I mentioned, and at a national level. And we have not, as far as demand is concerned, we have not considered the impacts of the pandemic for now. So the reference scenario is essentially a continuation of previous slides, previous trends, with certain changes that happen in the that we expect to happen. For example, agriculture demand, we have moved part of the agriculture demand to daytime. And we've also considered the impact of Ujjwala on cooking fuel demand as well in the reference scenario. We also assume that efficiency sort of improves at a certain rate, and electrification also happens of various parts of the energy sector also happens at a certain rate. Then we have a high efficiency scenario that we have defined, where we assume faster improvement in efficiency and increased electrification also happening in various sectors, specifically industry and transport. And these changes we assume are not are happening because of a strong policy push, because due to which technological changes are happening. That is, the efficiencies of various appliances are improving, various generation technologies are improving, and T&D losses are coming down. And but also the costs are also coming down because of economies of scale or whatever. But apart from the policy push, we also assume that there is a greater internalization of sort of the importance of efficiency in sort of meeting our developmental goals. And hence, we assume that certain behavioral changes also happen in terms of purchase behavior, appliance purchase behavior, usage, etc. And the third scenario that we have, the second scenario apart from the reference case, is the equity scenario, where we assume that India is more equitable. This is not due to any sort of policy input per se, but just that certain lower uh, um, consumption quintiles, expenditure, lower income quintiles, actually their incomes grow at a faster rate, and maybe the higher expenditure quintiles, their incomes grow at a slightly slower rate. So their incomes in the over the years sort of narrow down. The differences between their incomes narrow down at slightly compared to the reference scenario. So that is what we assume, and this equity basically happens across multiple dimensions. It happens at the urban-rural, interstate, as well as cross-quintile dimensions. And then finally, we have a load shift scenario where we assume that so the residential cooling service demand is determined based on the temperature projections, and this temperature could result in service demand during the day, which is perhaps not in tune with how occupancy of households happens. So we shift the demand to the evening and night time to account for this occupancy. Um, so now I would like to go over the results and insights very quickly, and then I'll end the presentation in the interest of time. to give enough time for the panel discussion. Um, so the first sort of observation that we have from this modeling runs is uh, is that demand from fans continues to be the single largest contributor to residential electricity demand even in FY 31. As you can see on the in the chart on the left hand side, fans are already at a fairly high penetration rate and they increase slightly up to 2031. But ACs are also catching up rapidly. So they grow from say 5% in the initial years to over 20% penetration ownership in 2031. Um, and subsequently, the residential electricity demand also is dominated by sort of the cooling demand for households, apart from the other demand, which is of course uh, it is a share of the total residential electricity demand that we have modeled. So fan demand continues to be, which is the yellow part here, continues to be quite significant, and and that you see here, and you can see that the green part, that the ACs, the demand from ACs is actually growing significantly. Looking at total energy demand, which is including cooking fuel sources as well, we see that in the reference case, the share of biomass in the total energy demand comes down, but not as much as some of us would like, because the higher use of biomass has certain uh, health as well as gender sort of impacts, and hence it is desirable to have even higher reductions in biomass use. And as we can see in the high efficiency scenario, with an increased push towards clean energy sources, we see that the biomass use comes down. But in the equity scenario, which is something that's not based on a sort of a policy intervention per se, we see that with the increased sort of incomes in the lower income households, the switch to LPG and other modern cooking fuel sources increases dramatically. So all of this highlights the importance of strong AC and fan efficiency programs, as well as the importance of the special efforts are needed to meet clean cooking goals that we have as a nation. On the supply side, the installed capacity is more than doubles from close to 400 gigawatts to over 900 gigawatts in FY31. 90% of that capacity added is solar and wind, together about 550 gigawatts, and about 30 gigawatts of storage is added. And this is sort of true across scenarios. As you can see here, there are slight differences in how much coal is added, but largely the capacity addition is dominated by solar and wind. As you can see in the left-hand side slide, also the dark gray here refers to legacy capacity. So we have considered retirements, but there's also coal capacity added and some gas-based capacity as well, and which basically means that coal-based capacity is more or less flat over the years. Um, but of course, there are limitations to Rumi in this particular model in terms of answering some of the more detailed sort of balancing or grid integration questions that might come up, and hence robust modeling studies are needed to determine where, of course, first to begin with citing of RE and storage projects, as well as where grid strengthening is needed, etc. Um, and also, if we look at the generation side of things, most of the incremental generation between FY20 and FY31 is from wind and solar, as one would expect. And if we look at FY31, still coal is the single largest source of generation with about 40 to 45 to 50% of the generation coming from coal. So coal is here to stay, as everyone would, I guess people would expect. And even in FY, in the next over the next decade, there is a chance of peak coal use for the power sector happening during the coming decade. But still, it plays a huge role even 10 years down the line. And that is true again across various scenarios. We don't see a whole lot of difference, significant difference across scenarios in terms of the capacity addition as well as the generation from those capacities. Um, uh, one thing to perhaps take away from this for policymakers is reduced coupling of coal and power sectors that will perhaps begin in in the coming decade, and perhaps even intensify beyond in the next decade. Coming to the equity scenario, reduced inequity could result in higher appliance penetration. So the way the inequity reduces is by increasing the MPCEs of various households, and that results in higher appliance ownership, as can be seen in the charts on the left-hand side, and consequently, the demand in the electricity consumption in poorer sort of households also goes up in the equity scenario. And here we have compared Bihar and Tamil Nadu, where across all quintiles, the uh, electricity consumption increases for both urban and rural in Bihar, whereas for Tamil Nadu, urban higher quintiles, the electricity consumption comes down slightly, whereas the lower quintiles in Tamil Nadu also sort of their consumption also increases in the equity scenario. Coming to the insights that we got from the load shift scenario, the as can be seen here, the top graph shows the reference scenario, the load sort of the time slice wise load in the reference scenario, and time slice wise load in the load shift scenario. It should be noticed. It should be noted here that the time slices are different across different durations. So this is not really a load sort of a load curve per se, but it is time slice wise demand across demand in gigawatts across various time slices across various seasons. Now we can see that the residential demand has a significant evening peak when there is no solar energy. However, the overall evening peak is not as pronounced when we look at the overall demand from across all sectors. But having said that, there is a significant role for different dispatchable generation sources to play in terms of meeting this additional demand. For example, we can see that in certain seasons and certain in the evening and afternoon, there is a huge ramp of the coal-based capacity. Gas also comes in at certain points, and storage also plays a role in terms of balancing the supply and demand. So these are some of the insights that we have seen. I will skip the comparison with other models, but we'll go over it very quickly, saying to say that just to talk about the residential energy demand, and then I'll skip the couple of slides later in the interest of time. What Rumi, how the projections by Rumi, the estimation of demand by in Rumi, when we compare it with other models, one thing that we see significantly different is the demand from fans that are estimated in Rumi as opposed to some of the other models. Likewise, the where fans demand from fans is higher in Rumi, and likewise the demand from ACs is lower in Rumi compared to some of the other projections that we've seen recently. When we come to residential fuel demand, Basically, we see not huge differences. Basically, biomass still plays a huge role, and of course, followed by LPG. Um, the electricity demand, when we compare it across various studies, the total electricity demand as projected in Rumi, as estimated in Rumi, are actually lower than many of the other projections, lower than EPS as a whole. And in the detailed slide deck that would have been shared with you, we have state-wise comparison of electricity demand from Rumi with EPS in 2027, for which we have disaggregated demand projections for EPS. Here we could not show the disaggregation for EPS, mainly because this is for 2031 and the EPS does not have projections for that year. But if we see the lower bound study or the sustainable development scenario studies, although they are not equivalent scenarios to our reference or high efficiency, we are the Rumi demand estimation is about the is around the estimation as the sustainable development scenarios in some of the other models. With that, I would like to end the presentation. I would like to thank all of you for attending this presentation, but also we would like to thank some of the energy sector, the researchers, and the entire research community that has provided us inputs during this process. In specifically, we would like to thank Renuka Sane from NIPFP, Vaibhav Chaturvedi from CEW, Tejal Kanitkar from NIAS, and Daljit Singh from Brookings, and all of our colleagues at Prayas as well, who have provided us very detailed sort of comments on while we were embarking on this journey. And I may have forgotten someone else, and if I have done so, I would seek apologies. It is sincere. Um, uh, it's not an intentional omission. Um, as I hand over to Aditya for the panel discussion now, I would like to also request you all to ask any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer that for the next few minutes as while the panel discussion is going on. With that, I'd like to hand over to Aditya for to conduct the panel discussion. Over to you, Aditya.
Hello, everyone. And thanks, Shriyari, for the great presentation. A lot of useful and interesting insights. And I guess there'll be a lot of questions. We'll now move to the panel discussion. And in the next hour or so, we would like to discuss the role, the importance, and policy relevance and challenges of demand oriented modeling in a dynamic world. And we have a great panel today. If I can ask my panelists to please switch on their videos so I can just introduce them. Yeah, so we have Navroz, Shonali, and Thomas. So Navroz Dubash is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, CPR, where he works on climate change, energy, air pollution, water policy, and the politics of regulation in developing world. Shonali Pachori is a senior research scholar with the energy program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, EASA, and her research focuses on the role of technological, institutional, and social innovations for inclusive human development. Thomas Spencer is a fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and his work focuses on energy transition in India's electricity and industry sectors. So before I move to the panel discussion, a quick word on the structure. We'll have about 3 to 4 rounds of discussion depending on the time we have. I think we are just about 5 to 8 minutes over the scheduled time, but that's okay. In the first rounds, the panelists will talk on some specific uh, aspects of this particular topic based on their research and experience. And in the third round, we'll take some questions from the audience. So along with your questions on Rumi, during the panel discussions, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. We'll compile them, and in the third round, we'll club them according to similar nature, and I'll ask them to the panelists. So that's all about it. And then let's get into the panel discussion. And we'll start with Navroz. Navroz, your recent work, and you have been talking about that, it focuses on the need for India's strategy to work to focus on multiple objectives simultaneously, which includes energy provision services and its linkages to social, economic, and environmental goals. And you have talked about in your recent paper the need for focusing on the demand patterns and the determinants of these patterns. So maybe you can talk a bit more on this approach, on this change in approach, and also, what do you think on how the demand-oriented energy systems modeling, such as Rumi, can aid and help the shift in energy policy approach? Navroz.
Great. Thank you very much, Aditya, and congratulations to all my colleagues at Prayas for this open source modeling framework. It's great, of course, that it's open source, and it's great that it's a systematic suite of open source models that I think will be really useful for the community. So to try and address Aditya's quite broad question, I think that it is probably appropriate to start by saying, why should we focus on the demand side? And what is kind of the motivation for that? And it's worth actually now recalling that India and Indian energy studies has a long and kind of distinguished trajectory and history of looking at the demand side, going all the way back to Amulya Reddy, who Girish Sant, one of the founders of Prayas, had also interacted with and been influenced by, and he had basically raised this question of why do we always look at where our energy is going to come from, how we're going to generate it, and let's look at what we want, what uses we want energy to be put to. So I would argue that in India today, in a very fast changing economy and society, so India is going through a demographic transition, it's going through rapid urbanization processes, it's going through infrastructure development. We basically have to, and we're doing this all in a context of rapid technological change. We have to basically ask what kind of society we want to build, and therefore what that energy is going to be used for. That's important to ask, because by making a choice, we might find that the ways in which we use energy to build that society will affect other objectives. And by other objectives, I mean things like everything from air quality to the livability of our cities, to gender questions, including sort of the time spent by women in particular in rural areas accessing energy, and so on. So it's not just a question of saying, here's how much energy we need, how do we get it? But when you broaden the frame to say, what do you want to use energy for? You find that you want to use energy not just to power industry, not just to light our lives or to run our computers, but also it shapes the kinds of cities we want to build, the kinds of lives, the kinds of communities we want to build. So there are much bigger questions that you can ask about energy when you come at it from the demand side. Now, that's a complicated enough question. It's even more complicated if you approach it as a modeler, and maybe my colleagues will come to that. So I will just say that I think it's important to have that larger frame, even if modeling can only shed light on a portion of it. But it's important for modelers to be aware of that larger frame. Let me just make one or two more quick points, and then I'll go back to the panel, because I know we want to be interactive here. The academic literature on so increasingly, particularly in the climate literature, there is an effort now to look at where are the interaction between development objectives and climate and energy objectives across, say, the SDGs. and all the academic literature that says if you want to achieve multiple objectives at the same time, say the SDGs, how do you best do that? And what the academic literature finds is that demand side responses often hit many more buttons across the SDGs than supply side responses. So if you want to progress on a number of fronts simultaneously, demand side measures tend to be better at doing that, which I think is another sort of interesting observation and a motivation for this kind of question. And just a third and final point as to why it's interesting to look at the demand side is often technology cycles are faster on the demand side. And in a society where where you're growing quite rapidly, you are locking into patterns for quite a long duration. So for example, let's just look at, so your model looks at fans, lights, and so on and so forth. Well, part of the lock-in is the design of your buildings, right? The building envelope itself, which you're locked into for at least a few decades. So looking at if you're a fast changing economy, looking at the potential to lock in energy efficiency, say, and lock out wasteful uses of energy is a huge opportunity right now. Something I think Thomas will pick up on is that if we are thinking about energy demand in this bigger way, then it is not just the appliances we invest in, but the structural changes we're bringing out in our economy. How are we providing jobs to people? What kinds of cities are we building? These kinds of long-term structural issues are actually going to be a very big factor in demand. They're not thought of as energy questions, but actually they are, in a sense, the first line energy questions that we should be thinking about. So I hope that this conversation looks at the demand side in this more encompassing way, and within that looks at what the models can contribute. So back to you, Aditya.
Thanks, Navroz, for kind of laying the broad context of and emphasizing the need for focusing on demand and looking at different structures of it. So with that, Shonali, I'll come to you. And one of your recent work has focused on, so essentially going into some details of modeling, so to say. You have been doing modeling for quite a long time. So your recent work has focused on new model for appliance and residential demand, and particularly looking at the energy poor people or people who have recently been electrified, because that model may be different from the usual models that have been used for. So, so I would like you to talk a little bit more on that, and then also how you think policymakers should interpret your results and how they should look at it and act on it. So, what do you, Shonali?
Thank you, Aditya, and hello, everyone. First, let me congratulate also the Prayas team on this exciting new model you've developed. I think this is a great initiative and will be really useful for the community at large, and also for doing sort of very interesting policy analysis. So I congratulate all of you on that. So to come to your question, Aditya, I mean, we've been working on household energy access and demand issues for several years now in my group. And, we've always focused on this in terms of a broader framing, as Navroz mentioned also in his comments, that we focused really very much on how to provide energy services for decent living, and how doing this relates to the broader sustainable development agenda. So that's really been the framing for our work. Currently, we're actually working on 3 different models that analyze different aspects of residential energy demand. So we have one that looks specifically at choices of cooking fuels and demand for cooking energy. We have the one that you mentioned, that is focusing largely on total residential energy demand, but with a specific focus on electric services, where we kind of break that down by different end use services, actually. And then we have a third model that's really looking at buildings demand. So that's looking at the building stock and the building turnover, and focusing specifically on building characteristics, which also kind of relates to the thermal energy needs, as Navroz mentioned. So all these models are being developed in parallel, but we are really trying to harmonize inputs, and over a period of time, we want to connect the models. So in terms of the key insights of our analysis, I mean, I think there are three kind of key takeaways that I can share with you here in terms of what we've learned and how I think that might also inform further developments within your own Rumi model. So the first is something that you've clearly highlighted with your work, which is that there's a need to incorporate a lot of granularity in residential energy demand models, because there's a vast heterogeneity in terms of infrastructure availability, consumer preferences and habits, and also the affordability of appliances and energy services. So having that granularity in these models is very, very important. Second, we found in our own analysis that low-income households are highly price sensitive. So when you're looking at energy services and demand for energy, I think it's very important to look at the cost and prices, both of energy, but also the appliances that provide the services that energy uses. And so, this also kind of points to the fact that we need to kind of think broader in terms of policies, to also look at policies and business models that make efficient appliances available and affordable even for low income households. And finally, when we're talking about drivers of demand, I mean, clearly income is a big driver of demand. And that's why even in our models, we consider the heterogeneity of households in terms of income quintiles or deciles or whatever. But the work that we're doing is also really pointing to the fact that there are a lot of non-income factors that are very important in driving demand. And especially availability, reliability of electricity supply is extremely important. Climate and weather patterns, of course, but also other socio-demographic characteristics of the population. And here again, I think one of the important lessons we've taken away is the fact that, informational campaigns and nudge policies to shape behaviors can be quite effective in changing demand patterns. So yeah, I'll stop with that for now, and I'm happy to take additional questions.
Yeah, thanks, Shonali. And I'll have some follow-up questions in maybe subsequent rounds. But before that, coming to Thomas. So, Thomas, you have also done modeling, and you have conducted an analysis to project India's electricity demand till 2030, considering various macroeconomic indicators. And then in your latest report, you also analyzed the impact of COVID-19 on energy consumption. So can you talk a little bit on both the things, as in your previous work, and how the pandemic would impact the energy consumption, and from a modeling point of view, how do you look at it? Thomas.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks to the Prayas team for the invitation. And let me add my very warm congratulations to those of Navroz and Shonali. This is really a fantastic piece of work, very timely, very on point as usual. So I think maybe I'll just try and make 3 or 4 points in this first round so that we can keep it moving quickly. I think the number one thing that we have learned from the past demand forecasts that we made in 2018 and then the updated ones that we released this year after the COVID pandemic hit is really a better understanding of why we make forecasts. And I think there's this misperception that people make forecasts in order to say one thing about the future. I think that's incorrect. We should make forecasts to understand the key relationships and key uncertainties, the key drivers of different outcomes. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy among academics and even more so among policymakers to put out a range of scenarios because this creates the impression of uncertainty. But I think it's only through having a range of scenarios that you can understand okay, if I change this variable, what is the outcome of changing that variable on my forecast? So I think, we have to understand scenarios and forecasting as essentially really complicated if-then statements. If something occurs, then something else will occur. That it's nothing more than that, really. And so this brings to me to my second point, which is you have to be transparent about your assumptions. I find it consistently amazing that the Electric Power Survey never even mentions the word GDP, right? For me, that is sort of like you ask someone for a map and they give you a destination instead, right? Without something about your assumptions, about your drivers, a forecast is completely meaningless. You cannot interpret it. So you cannot say today that the EPS is outdated because the macroeconomic scenario has worsened, because we don't know what macroeconomic scenario it was based on, if any, right? So transparency around your assumptions and drivers and so on is I think the second thing that we have learned. I think the third thing that we have learned is the timeliness of forecasting exercises. So I'll take again the EPS, and sorry to pick on it, but it's published every 5 or 6 years, right? And if you look at other forecasts that are made, either in the macroeconomic or energy sector basis, they're produced almost annually. And I think it's understandable, but you could say, okay, if you have an annual forecast and that forecast keeps changing, it creates uncertainty. It creates a lack of precision. But I really see it as the other way around. If you look at the annual forecasts that have been made by the IMF of India's GDP over the last 5 or 6 years, these tell a story about how we got here. What changed as we made forecast after forecast after forecast? What have we learned, right? And so it is having that long time series of forecasts that actually builds up a much better understanding of, okay, how did we get to this point and what does it mean for how I think about the future going forward? And you can say the same thing for the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook. People like to say that they got this or that wrong and so on. But I think if you read the storyline of their annual editions over the last 10 years, you actually get a much better understanding of what the future might look like than if you just pick one and read it, right? So I think having made one set of forecasts in 2018 and having made one set of forecasts in 2020, we're more than ever convinced that you need at least this kind of regularity. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thanks. So there were great opening comments. So I'll kind of follow up on some specific points that each of you mentioned, and then we can take the conversation forward. So starting with you, Shonali. So you talked about the heterogeneity and also the granularity of models, and particularly the bottom-up models that we have. And we do find that, which you also mentioned, a number of factors actually drive the ownership of appliances and also the use of appliances. So how can you talk a little bit more, and one other, the response to temperature or the ideas of thermal comfort, that itself are very subjective. So can you talk a little bit more on them, on how a modeler should approach these heterogeneities? What are the kind of best practices, what you have done in your past experience, that can be useful uh, uh, for this kind of modeling exercise?
Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Another great question. And yeah, there's no simple answer to it. But I mean, of course, the fact is when we are talking about heterogeneity and increasing the granularity in our models, we are not doing that just for the sake of increasing granularity in the model. I mean, the idea is to try to capture those aspects of heterogeneity that really drive demand, or are important drivers of demand. So as you mentioned, I mean, of course there are multiple factors that drive demand, and when we're looking at granularity, it's important to say that it's not only sort of granularity in terms of spatial characteristics or population characteristics, but it's also improving our understanding and adding heterogeneity in terms of considering different end uses, time of use, season of use, and so on, as you've mentioned. So, I mean, just to elaborate on this a little bit further, I can give you an example of another piece of work that we've been doing, which is sort of trying to understand cooling gaps in the global south. Because, I mean, again, one of the big growing areas of electricity demand around the world is demand for meeting cooling needs. And we know that this will without doubt rise in the future also because of climate change. So in work that we did, which was kind of trying to look at understanding these cooling gaps, we combined spatially explicit information on climate, on electricity access, and also on AC adoption and building characteristics, because it's the interplay of these different things that really matter. And then we use this to really assess the location and size of populations that are could are potentially exposed to heat stress and the gap in cooling energy demand to provide them with adequate cooling services. And while when we were doing that work, we thought a lot about trying to apply these kind of more adaptive comfort approaches. In the end, we didn't do it because we just didn't have enough information on it. But actually, as you said, the demand for cooling is very subjective and related to preferences on what is a comfortable indoor environment, temperature wise. But in order to kind of address that question, what we did do is instead consider different set point temperatures or thresholds on indoor temperature, not just the outdoor temperature. That means taking into account also the building envelope and how building characteristics influence indoor temperature. And then tested our results considering different sensitivities to these thresholds. So assuming not that everyone wants an 18 or 19 degrees Celsius indoor comfort level, but really that this could range widely from 18 to even 26, 27 degrees Celsius indoor temperature. And we explicitly tried to do this because we wanted to test how much our results will change by considering the different threshold levels. And what we found very interestingly is that the set point temperature or these thresholds and the numbers of days of exposure to temperatures above the thresholds really strongly influenced our results in terms of both affected population and energy demand for cooling. And so, I mean, I think this kind of points to the fact that there's like potentially a lot of additional drivers of demand that one can consider in analysis that we do, that also then inform the kind of policies that we want to see enacted. Because what we found from our work in particular was that there's a potential to lower these cooling gaps and the cooling energy demand by going beyond typical analysis of AC efficiency policies to also consider like things like passive building design, cool roofs, and behavioral interventions to get people to use ACs more frugally, like setting lower set point temperatures and hours of use and so on. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, thanks. So I guess one other, as in a related point, is also to achieve that kind of a golden mean, so to say, where your model is not complicated enough so that there are a number of scenarios and it addresses everything. At the same time, it is simple enough that policymakers can use it and act on it. Another challenge, and Thomas, you talked about it a little bit in your opening remarks, is the challenge of these kind of incorporating the effect of sudden events like COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, by nature, you won't be able to predict them. But what kind of additional care or what kind of additional considerations that someone should take or a modeler, what kind of best practices a modeler can look at while incorporating these kind of sudden events. And a related question is also something which Navroz talked in his opening remarks, the technology lock-in, or whenever you model some kind of technology development, how do you make sure you also incorporate the fluidity in the technological advancement? Thomas.
Yeah, so I think the first question is really great, and it's something that is very close to my heart. So I think there's a couple of points that I would make here. The first one is, I think if you're looking at how do you model the impact of shocks and unexpected events, my view is, and this is something that I think you've done fantastically well in Rumi, is you can only do it by linking the macro and the micro. So maybe this would be easiest if I give an example. Right now, many people are talking about, what would be the impact for the energy sector of a long-term shift from, the current office-based environment to much more work from home. And for example, a very really significant reduction in retail floor space and so on, and much more shift to sort of Amazon and Flipkart retail model, right? I think that's a real question. That's a macro question, right? If your model incorporates micro variables like your commercial floor space, right? Then you can say, okay, what is the impact if I assume a 10% reduction in commercial floor space and a comparable increase in the in residential consumption from work from home. So I think, this is just one example, but the general principle holds of if you can try and link the macro to the micro, then you can have an approach to deal with these kind of shocks. The other thing is, I think to do this well, you have to think about consistent storylines, and you have to think about their interrelationship, right? So, for example, let me take your efficiency scenario. Sorry, your equity scenario. And I think this is actually one of the biggest questions in Indian modeling today. Do we assume that rural consumption patterns converge towards urban consumption patterns? Because all of the projections that we have are that rural households will still be a really significant share by 2050. So a consistent storyline around this would be, for me, India gets a lot of macro policy right. We start to develop manufacturing and labor-intensive manufacturing a bit better. We start to have a bit more exports in these sectors. We start to do urbanization a bit better. We revive the construction industry, and this all of these factors boost, the lower income tiers. But of course, the storyline that I just spoke about has a lot of repercussions outside of the residential sector, right? If urbanization picks up and construction picks up, it's steel and cement as well, and so on and so forth. So I think you need to think about sort of consistent storylines that fit together in a logically coherent way and try and model them, right? Third point that I would make is you have to think carefully if you're looking at sort of macro-driven models about which macro variables drive your model. For example, if you had tried to project Indian steel consumption over the last 10 years using GDP, you probably would have over-projected it, right? Because Indian GDP has grown quite robustly, but Indian steel demand has not in the last 10 years. And part of this might be because, as Arvind Subramanian hypothesizes, GDP data is over-projected and overestimated. The other bit might be that, the sectors that have grown in the last 10 years are not the steel-intensive ones, but they are the knowledge-intensive ones of, business processing, outsourcing, financial services, and so on. If, on the other hand, you had said, okay, steel demand in my model is going to be driven by investment, and you had tried to project using investment over the last 10 years, then you might have got a bit closer because investment has effectively fallen a lot as the construction industry has suffered, as firms have not set up so many production facilities and so on. And this is another way to link that sort of macro storyline with your micro demands. Okay, so what if we have an India which doesn't do urbanization and infrastructure development so well? Well, this is going to show up in your investment numbers, right? and that will then translate into your steel and cement demands. Fourth thing, and I'll stop here, these things are difficult to automate, right? The development of the kind of storylines that I've talked about, they're difficult to automate. I think there's no way out, sort of lots of exogenous assumptions outside of the model, lots of Excels, bringing in these end-use demands into the model and then looking at them like that. So while I think the move to sort of open source modeling is really, really welcome and something that we also support at TERI, I think there's no replacement for modeling teams really working hard to develop sort of more complex storylines than maybe you can fit in an automatable open source model. But just being transparent about the storylines and assumptions that drive those scenarios.
Thanks. Great. So before I come back to you, Navroz, I would like to remind for the participants, if they have any questions for the panelists, please type in the Q&A box, and then we'll compile them and ask in the third round or whatever next subsequent round of discussions. So Navroz, coming back to you. So you did talk about that traditionally focusing on demand is not a new thing per se, as we have been talking about it. And you did talk about Amulya Reddy and his approach. Uh, uh, I would like to ask you, in the current policy, regulatory and institutional mechanism, what do you think? How do we? So we have highlighted the importance of it, and through modeling, we also discussed the modalities of it. But to put it into actual decision making, what kind of changes do you think would be required in the current mechanisms in India? So a little bit on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, so Thomas highlighted the challenges sort of linking across scales in a sense with models. And there's an analogous problem when it comes to looking at policy and regulatory kinds of questions, right? So one of the reasons why I think energy policy is focused on the supply side is just because it's more legible. You know, you have these large structures, these large entities. You have Coal India Limited. You may have a lot of them and they may be messy, but at least you know that if you're talking about the electricity sector, you've got to focus on your discom. There's a finite set of actors. You understand the linkages reasonably well, and so on. On the demand side, it gets much messier. You have transport policy, for example, that is embedded within not just so urban transport is embedded within larger urban planning. Of course, there's also intercity transport and different modes of that. You have to deal with motorized transport, non-motorized transport. You have to deal with different fuel sources and fuel lobbies. You have to deal with automakers and automaker lobbies, and so on and so forth. You also have questions of scale, right? So you have a Ministry of Urban Development at the central level, but then most urban decisions are actually decentralized down to states and the urban local bodies. So you have governance questions across scales. So that's just an example from transport, but the same holds true in many other demand sectors. So in that context, translating insights from models about where do you want to go to actually putting in place a set of policy levers that get you there is really hard. And it passes through having a set of institutional boxes with those levers actually built into it, right? So the problem happens at several levels. One is at the very basic level, we often don't have, this is something that Srihari from your team has written about, we just don't have data that bubbles up about demand patterns from all these scales because it's harder, right? You call up Coal India Limited and they give you, okay, they may give you problematic data, but at least they'll give you data and it's one place. Whereas if you want to know the demand side, you have so many more actors just to get the data from. Then you have to build that analytically into a picture and then build the policy signals that send it back down. So you ask for, okay, I spent a lot of time laying out the problem, and I know that you wanted me to actually give you a sense of what solutions might exist. Let me give you a couple of ideas. You know, in the electricity literature, as you well know, one of the ways in which people try to get attention to the demand side is through mechanisms like integrated resource planning, right? Which basically said, instead of just talking about how much more electricity you want to generate, you focus on what energy services you want to deliver, and some of them might happen by inducing changes on the demand side. I don't think we've fully made use, and then there was a question of whether that's still possible in the world of we're moving towards electricity markets and so on and so forth. That debate never has got fully played out, and we've never fully kind of closed the loop on whether one can do more with those kinds of processes in India. One of the things my colleagues and I have worked on at CPR in collaboration with Prayas is asking questions to come back to your first question of me, Aditya. If you have a multiple objective approach, can you then have a tool that allows you to systematically ask the question of which policy approaches best hit at those multiple objectives? And if you remember, I said that demand approaches typically do so more reliably. If we have a tool that allows us to filter all our policy responses and ask which of them best hits multiple buttons, that might be very useful as a way forward. So we developed this idea, we built rather on this idea many others have had about multi-criteria decision analysis, where you say you start by listing out your criteria, you look at your policy solutions, and then through quantitative but also qualitative approaches, you try and understand which of these different approaches best allow you to hit as many objectives as possible. The general theme behind all of this is you don't start with a solution. You actually start with an objective, and you start with a range of possible solutions, and then you filter them by looking at your options. So this idea of options assessment, where you're actually systematically assessing your options. You're not just presuming that when you have a traffic jam, your answer is more roads, right? You might actually have several options that you could have, including, of course, more public transport, more non-motorized transport, zoning changes that allow people to live closer to where they work from home, to take a trendy thing that Thomas has brought up. So there are actually several options, right? So once you have a framework for assessing options, it induces you to look at more of those options. So I think that's the spirit behind what we need to do. We need to have frameworks that allow us to look at more options, and then tools that allow us to look at them sensibly. And that's the way you'll get demand approaches into the mix.
Okay. So I'll also kind of extend this question to both Shonali and Thomas, since you have worked in multiple countries and policymakers with countries. I mean, so what has been your experience and of how policymakers or how do you engage with policymakers with the modeling insights, and then what kind of again this policy, regulatory, institutional mechanisms are there any? I know it's a very broad question, but maybe one or two examples of, this is how it should be done, or this is how it should not be done, something like that. So Shonali and then Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Very important question, and actually, ultimately, the question that drives all our research. So, yeah, I mean, of course, again, there's no simple solution to that, but I think Navroz touched upon many of them, and Thomas mentioned some of that as well, which is kind of when we're talking about addressing or doing any kind of analysis, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of doing that? I mean, why are we doing this analysis? Why are we building a particular tool or model or whatever? What are the kind of questions we want to answer with that? And I mean, I think increasingly within the science sphere as well, we are understanding that we can't use science to find effective solutions unless we engage quite early on with policymakers and stakeholders, because the idea is also to really try to understand what are their concerns, where are they coming from, what are their what are the barriers they face in terms of designing policies and enacting policies and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think that's partly something that the science community is slowly learning. But I mean, I think Navroz mentioned several things, but I think the one key thing that I think stands out for me is the fact that in many cases, you know, we need to really think about the objectives of what we're trying to do. So whether, you know, we're talking about energy demand, we're not talking about energy demand, we're talking about providing energy services to people to improve their lives, to improve their welfare, and to basically do this in a way that's, you know, doesn't mess up our environment, doesn't you know have huge environmental footprints. And so, you know, if we always keep that in the back of our minds and then engage with policymakers, and also in some ways try to bring more policy coherence within what we do. Because I mean, the fact is, you know, at the moment we live in institutional structures where often the energy ministry won't necessarily talk to the health ministry or the environment ministry. I mean, depending on which country you're on, the structures are always different. But really trying to engage with these multiple stakeholders to also sort of then show the multiple benefits, or in some cases the trade-offs with certain options, that then helps to get the buy-in from them as well, in terms of showing them, oh, okay, if I choose this option, I'm achieving uh, three things with one policy or one set of policies. So I mean, I think that's kind of the area where we are trying to now expand our work more and more, is really sort of trying to look at ways of informing policy that then also sort of tells the story of not only these are the options, but what these options can achieve in terms of multiple benefits and trade-offs.
Okay. Thomas, some quick comments on your uh, interactions with policymakers on modeling results.
Yeah, so just I think two things I'd like to say here. The first one is I think we ourselves have an erroneous model of how this works. You know, I think we have a simplistic model of, okay, you build a model, you run it, and then you go and tell the policymaker, and the policymaker does something, right? It's a very linear model. But I think the way that things work in the real world is much more around what does the community at large, you know, the epistemic community think about certain problems, right? So reforms didn't happen in the 90s because someone had a model that said, you know, if you liberalize your economy, you'll grow 2 percentage points faster across the 90s. Reforms happened because, broadly speaking, the epistemic community had agreed that, you know, the socialist model had driven India into an impasse. So I think we have to look at how are our models shaping the epistemic community that ultimately hopes to influence policy. And I think here we come up against some problems because I think, you know, we're not transparent enough about our models. We are not comprehensive enough about describing our assumptions and their limitations. And I think really the only way that you can get an epistemic community to think the same way about a problem is to really have this transparent process of digging through your assumptions and model outputs. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is I think when we think of the way that governments do modeling, again, I think we have to think of this as a process and not an outcome. I think the value of modeling for government agency is not that it helps them necessarily to make better decisions because they have come up with a number. If that's the objective of modeling, then it's the wrong kind of modeling. But rather that it imposes some structure and discipline on decision making. So for me, having lived now for 3 years in India, I think a really big question is how can we create sort of institutional obligations to do the right kind of modeling more regularly in the right places? And that I think is a question that hasn't yet been answered. Now, I think we've not really made the transition from the sort of planning commission approach to the Niti Aayog approach. I think, you know, some kind of structured and regular modeling exercise could be useful in that transition, at least for the energy sector.
Okay, great. So now there are a few questions from the participants, uh, and so maybe okay, I'll take this question, and maybe Thomas, you would be the right person to answer it. So, yeah, the question is: do you think that it is possible that the variables which we consider while modeling an energy system are they complete on their own, or does the role of chaotic variables they always prevail in the long run, and it hampers the overall accuracy of the forecast? Uh, so you have touched a few things on this, but do you want to answer that, Thomas?
Yeah, I had read that question in the chat and hoped it wouldn't be asked to me. But no, I think essentially what we have to think of is, we are trying to model a system that has some well understood behaviors. And the way that it reacts to chaotic variables is also more or less understood. We knew that if we shut the economy for 3 months, it would have a negative effect on the economy, and we knew that that would have a negative effect on energy demand, right? So that variable was chaotic, but how the system responded was relatively well understood, right? So I do think that the systems that we are trying to understand have certain laws is absolutely the wrong term. They don't have laws. They have well observed patterns of response to inputs leading to more or less well understood outputs, right? And I think this particularly holds for a big slow moving sector like energy. People always say, oh, we get forecasts so wrong, we never predicted the mobile phone. But if you had predicted in the year 1900 that the world in 2000 would still be run on the internal combustion engine and the steam turbine, you would have been correct, right? So there are some big sort of structural things that we know about the energy system that should allow us to sort of discount the most outlandish hypotheses, like everyone having flying cars in the next 20 years.
Okay, and then so there's a question for Shonali, where do you have an example where your group has communicated insights from your analysis, and has it happened when some parts of energy analysis are more welcome to policymakers than the others? And you talked a little bit in your previous remarks on the objectives and how policymakers should be involved right from the beginning, but uh, do you have some one or two examples on that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to expand more on that. So, actually, work that I did with the young scientists. We have a young scientist summer program at YASA where we have 50 odd PhD students coming to the institute every summer, and then we do research along with these young scientists. And a couple of years ago, I had a young scientist who started looking at trying to evaluate the LPG program, the new LPG program in India, the Ujjwala program. And this was like really exciting work because he had these very interesting data sets that allowed us to do some interesting analysis. And we did feed these insights into policy processes. So he was very closely linked with the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, and we also provided inputs to them on this. And I think that that has helped. I mean, work that we did prior to that also, I think, in some ways helped inform or shape the policy. I mean, because we had been harping on and on for a very long time on the fact that in order to improve clean cooking access in India, which is like a huge issue, has multiple benefits for the environment, for people's health, and so on and so forth, for women's empowerment and so on. That one can't focus only on improving, providing subsidies on LPG fuel, because it's really the upfront costs of acquiring the LPG stoves and the connection to LPG that is a big barrier for many people. So I think that did help shape the policy in India on Ujjwala. And then now some of the insights that we've tried to bring out with our evaluation on why is it that people who have the connection are still not using LPG regularly, will hopefully also help influence Ujjwala 2.0 and really bring about the change in terms of not only adoption of LPG, but then regular use of LPG.
Okay, great. There's one more question for you, and moving from the decision making to some nitty-gritties of modeling. You talked about heterogeneity and how it can be addressed. So, what do you think about agent-based modeling, and what are the pros and cons of it in incorporating behaviors of different actors? What are your views on it, Shunali?
I'm sorry, Aditya, I didn't get the question. The quality of the voice suddenly disappeared. Could you repeat it?
Sorry, yes, yes. So the question is more on agent-based modeling. You talked about heterogeneity and how behavior comes into picture. So what are the pros and cons of using that approach for modeling?
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, another very great question. I mean, I think when it comes to modeling, again, a heterogeneity of approaches to modeling is important to consider, because each model comes with its own strengths and weaknesses, and no one model can answer all questions. So, sort of considering the heterogeneity of types of models and then trying to choose a model that fits the purpose of the modeling, of the kind of questions that you want to answer with the modeling, is very, very critical. So agent-based models are great because they provide a lot of ability to understand how individuals interact, how social norms can perhaps influence behaviors in some situations, and to consider the heterogeneity of individual behaviors, whether we're talking about households or firms or whatever. So in that sense, agent-based models are extremely useful. The downsides of agent-based models are the fact that you need a lot of very detailed data to calibrate these models. The data is, of course, not always easily available. And then, of course, there's the question that we've talked about several times now in this panel of scaling up. So you can build a beautiful agent-based model that tells you a lot of really good insights on how agents in a certain context function. But then how do you use that to really scale up to derive insights that are important to policy in a broader context, considering the macro environment as well? So yeah, I mean, I think agent-based models have a big role to play, but they are one in a whole scheme of model types that I think we need to keep in our armory as we move forward.
Okay, great. Thanks. Navroz, coming to you, and probably maybe a last question before some concluding remarks. But coming to you, Navroz, what role do you think academic institutions and think tanks, what role do you think academic institutions and think tanks would play in and the question I'm asking it to you because you did one of your papers, you also compared results from different models and how they can be used. And that was in the context of climate policy. But what role do you think in Indian context, the academic institutions and research think tanks can play in improving our capabilities as a nation on energy modeling, and also having more kind of uptake or more adoption of the insights and translating it into policy actions?
Yeah, very good, really good question, Aditya. I think I'm going to pick up where a point that Thomas made in his first intervention, where he said that too often the way in which we've approached modeling in the policy process in India is as trying to get a single unitary answer. What will energy demand be in X year? What will coal use be in Y year? When will we peak, and so on? And really, it's a it's a complex dynamic as to how one changes that perspective. I think we have turned a corner on that, in that we have many fewer conversations around that, partly because we have a richer and deeper modeling community. I think the paper that you referred to was, our small effort at trying to make the case that trying to have a simple linear policy process that says we're going to ask a question about the future, we're going to ask one group to give us an answer, and then we're going to build our policy around that answer, that was not tenable if 5 different groups had 5 different defensible answers. Clearly we had to, so the paper was really a very simple paper to make that point. And if that's the case, what we suggested was that, in fact, the richness of it comes from trying to understand why you have different answers, and are you implicitly or explicitly asking different questions, which then leads you into a conversation about what questions you want to ask. So instead of simply saying, here are India's immutable energy needs and therefore immutable carbon needs, you actually say, what kind of society do we want to build? What does that then imply for the kind of energy systems we need to build, which is a much more complex question. And that's hard to introduce complexity, because at the end of the day, the government of India is populated by very smart people who are very busy and who don't have a lot of backup in terms of people they can go to for answers. So one of the things I think we as think tanks should not do is simply answer a question that is a simple question that is posed to us if we think it might be an incomplete question or a wrong question. I think we have to come back and say, okay, we'll try and help you with that question, but have you thought of reframing the question a little bit, asking this different complementary question? And if we are not, if we think that there are multiple answers and different perspectives, actually using the access we have to bring multiple voices and trying to have a conversation around the table. And I think that actually there's been a lot more collaborative work being done by think tanks in the last few years. And I think we've made some headway in bringing about that more sort of deliberate engagement. I do think that one of the challenges with the policy process is that, as I said, policy makers have very limited time, very little attention, and often don't have the technical backup. So increasingly, the capacity story is reasonably good on the side of those with voices. It's less good on the side of those who we are trying to reach with those voices. And that's really a constraint that we continue to face, just because of problems of time and complexity and pressure for immediate decisions, not because of the people themselves. So, thanks.
Okay, wise words as always. So I think with that, we have 5 minutes above our scheduled time, but I think this has been a fascinating and very interesting discussion for me personally, definitely, and I hope to everyone who is still there in the webinar, and there are quite a few people, it looks like. So before we end, one last comment that everyone would like to make about the key takeaways, or what do you think as the next steps on the demand-oriented energy systems modeling, and where do we go from here? So maybe Thomas, Pranali, and then Navroz. Thomas, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. One thing, I don't know if I would name this a key next step. I think that would be presumptuous, but one thing that I would really like to see is a sort of collaborative effort among a few different institutions to come up with some storylines for India's development future and model those storylines, and be as explicit about, what this means for the different demand and use sectors and so on, and how those storylines interact with those demand and use sectors.
Great, Pranali.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think I won't say that this is kind of next step, but in line with what Thomas said in terms of sort of exploring different scenarios. I mean, I was even thinking in terms of like when you presented the results of the scenarios that you ran, there's so many different nuances you can play with in those scenarios. that would be really interesting to explore. So, for example, in the equity scenario that you talked about, that you've already run, uh, uh, from my understanding of what you said, it seems like you've kind of assumed that the growth rates of income for different quintiles has been varied to kind of define this new equity scenario. But there again, there are so many different options that one could consider. Like, for instance, are you thinking about redistributive policies in terms of changing the equity and inequality in incomes in India? Are you thinking of slowing urbanization, or developing rural areas more comprehensively to halt rapid urbanization in terms of changing that inequality? So, I mean, again, I mean, it follows on what Thomas just mentioned, to think about sort of defining a broader set of scenarios, and then also thinking about clear storylines in terms of what are the objectives that one is kind of uh, envisaging for achieving with with these particular scenarios, and how, and then trying to understand a little bit better what through through the modeling, what could be potential benefits of different options and potential trade-offs of those options for achieving other goals within the Indian situation.
Okay, thanks. Navroz?
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I'm going to pick up from Sonali's point, and I've been quite expansive in my comments, but let me kind of dig deep now. You know, in that flow chart that Srihari presented, there's a bit in the top right-hand corner, which is basically a little bit of kind of top-down. We look at GDP, we look at elasticities, we do some projections. And I guess there's a trade-off when you have a model like this. You have to make it open access and accessible enough that, as Thomas was saying, you can play with it and get something useful, at the same time as not limiting the imagination by saying there are only a finite number of levers. And I guess the trick is going to be, how does one use the model to ask the kinds of questions Sonali was asking? Bigger questions about urbanization patterns, bigger questions about sort of lock into transport and lifestyles and so on and so forth. That, so you make an assumption based on elasticity and future GDP, and that conceals a whole set of assumptions about political choices and social choices. Now, you can't do everything at the same time, but I think you can embed the model in a larger conversation. And I think it's very important, as you build a user community, to try and embed the model in that larger conversation. It says, if we had a fundamentally different set of choices about urbanization, it might mean that these top-down things would change quite a bit, right? So finding some way to introduce that fluidity so that models kind of open the imagination rather than closing them. I think that's really the trick.
Great. So some food for thought for the Rumi team. And thank you, Thomas, Sonali, and Navroz, for taking out time. I think it has been a great discussion. And I hope Ashok and Srihari were able to answer all the questions that people had about Rumi. And I think if not, maybe we'll take them up personally after the webinar. So great, we are just 12 minutes over the time, and I think that's all right, given the great presentation and the discussion we had. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Congratulations again.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.